Welcome to Luxury Empire Stories.
What happens when a man's ultimate betrayal becomes the most devastating financial and personal mistake of his life? Arthur Pendleton thought he had the world completely figured out. He was trading in his quiet, frugal wife for a wealthy executive's daughter, securing a golden path to the top of the corporate ladder. When he slammed the divorce papers on their scuffed kitchen table, he didn't just walk away. He gloated. He was proud. But Arthur was completely blind. He had absolutely no idea the woman quietly signing her name, asking for nothing in return, was the sole heiress to a $4 billion corporate empire. This is the true-to-life story of a prideful signature, a blinding delusion, and a reckoning that shook Seattle's elite. The rain in Seattle always had a way of making everything look a little more grey. But to Arthur Pendleton, his entire life had felt grey for the past 3 years. He sat at the small, laminate kitchen table of their 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, staring at the chipped rim of his coffee mug. Across from him stood Chloe. She was wearing an oversized, faded University of Washington sweatshirt, her hair tied up in a messy bun, quietly packing his lunch into a reusable container. She looked entirely ordinary. Too ordinary. Arthur was a senior portfolio manager at Ovation Financial, a mid-sized wealth management firm that catered to the Pacific Northwest's newly rich. He spent his days surrounded by Italian wool suits, Rolex submariners, and conversations about summer homes in the Hamptons. Then he would commute back to this cramped apartment, and to Chloe, a freelance graphic designer who clipped digital coupons and insisted they buy off-brand cereal to save for a rainy day. "I put the leftover chicken parm in here," Chloe said, turning around with a gentle smile. "Should be good for lunch." "I know you have that big meeting with the Brentwood account today," Arthur bristled, ignoring the container. "I'm having lunch with Harrison Brentwood at the Rainier Club, Chloe. I can't walk into the office carrying Tupperware like an intern." Chloe's smile faltered, but she quickly masked it, setting the container on the counter. "Right, of course. Good luck with the meeting, Arthur." Arthur didn't reply. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, shielding the screen. "Jessica, can't wait for tonight. Tell me you're finally handling the dead weight." A smirk played on Arthur's lips. Jessica Brentwood, daughter of Harrison Brentwood, the regional director of Ovation Financial and Arthur's direct superior. Jessica was everything Chloe wasn't. Glamorous, draped in Prada, aggressive, and fiercely ambitious. For the past 6 months, Arthur and Jessica had been carrying on a torrid affair in high-end hotel rooms and the back seats of Ubers. Jessica had made it clear, if Arthur wanted the upcoming vice president position and a permanent place in the Brentwood family's wealthy inner circle, he needed to shed his mediocre life. He looked back at Chloe. She was scrubbing a pan in the sink, humming softly. She had been a good wife, he supposed, in a docile, boring sort of way. They met in college, bonding over late-night study sessions. But while Arthur outgrew his college mindset, hungry for power and status, Chloe seemed content to stay stagnant. She never wanted to attend his corporate galas. She never bought designer clothes. She drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic. Arthur felt a surge of self-righteous justification. He was an eagle. She was a sparrow. You couldn't blame an eagle for wanting to fly with its own kind. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie. A gift from Jessica. "I won't be home for dinner," Arthur said coldly. "In fact, I need you to sit down. I have something to give you before I leave." Chloe turned off the faucet. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed deafening in the silence of the apartment. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked over, sitting across from him. Her hazel eyes were calm, almost unnervingly so. Arthur reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "What is this?" Chloe asked, her voice steady. "It's over, Chloe," Arthur said, puffing his chest out slightly, feeling a rush of adrenaline. "Those are divorce papers. I've already signed them." Chloe didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She stared at the envelope for a long, agonizing moment before slowly sliding her finger under the flap and pulling out the documents. "Arthur," she began softly, scanning the first page. "Is this a joke?" "I assure you it's not," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms. He felt entirely in control. "I've outgrown this, Chloe. I've outgrown us. Look around. This apartment, the budget pinching, the mundane routine. I am destined for the top tier of the financial world. I need a partner who understands that world, a partner who brings something to the table." Chloe looked up, her expression unreadable. "And I don't bring anything to the table?" Arthur let out a short, condescending laugh. "You're a freelance artist. Making what, 40 grand a year? You refuse to network. You embarrass me in front of my colleagues by talking about thrift stores. I've met someone else, Chloe. Someone in my league. Jessica Brentwood." He dropped the name like a bomb, expecting devastation. He expected tears, screaming, perhaps a slap. Jessica's father was practically Arthur's boss. The implications were massive. Instead, Chloe's eyes flickered with a strange, fleeting emotion. Was it amusement? Pity? Jessica Brentwood. Chloe repeated the name slowly, testing the weight of it. Harrison Brentwood's daughter. The regional director who just took out a second mortgage on his Mercer Island estate to cover his wife's gambling debts. Arthur frowned, leaning forward. "What the hell are you talking about? The Brentwoods are loaded. Harrison is pulling in 7 figures. "If you say so," Chloe murmured, flipping to the back of the divorce decree. She skimmed the settlement terms. "You want a clean break. No alimony. You keep the Lexus, I keep the Civic, and we split the meager savings in the joint account. It's fair," Arthur defended immediately, his tone sharp. "I earned 90% of the money in that account anyway. You should be grateful I'm not fighting you for the furniture." "I am grateful, Arthur," Chloe said. She reached for a cheap ballpoint pen sitting next to a pile of mail. Arthur blinked. "Wait, you're just going to sign it? You're not going to fight? No lawyers?" Chloe clicked the pen. She looked Arthur dead in the eyes, and for the first time in their 8-year relationship, Arthur felt a cold chill run down his spine. The warmth that usually radiated from her was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute emptiness. "You want a partner who brings something to the financial table," Chloe said quietly. "You want status. You want Jessica. I wouldn't dream of standing in the way of a man and his pride." She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name with a flourish. "Chloe Jenkins." She slid the papers back across the table. "I'll pack my things. You can have the apartment for the rest of the month. I'll be gone by the time you get back from your high-level lunch." Arthur grabbed the papers, a triumphant grin breaking across his face. It was too easy. He had won. He stood up, practically vibrating with excitement. "You're making the right choice, Chloe. Believe me, you wouldn't survive in the world I'm heading into anyway. Take care of yourself." He didn't look back as he walked out the door. If he had, he would have seen Chloe pull her phone from her pocket and dial a number. "Hello, David," Chloe said into the receiver. "It's done. Yes, he signed it. Call my father. Tell him he doesn't need to hold off on the Ovation financial acquisition anymore. Burn it to the ground." For the first 3 months, Arthur Pendleton lived like a king. He moved out of the dreary apartment in Capitol Hill and into Jessica's sprawling, glass-walled penthouse in downtown Seattle. He was promoted to Vice President of Acquisitions at Ovation Financial, just as Jessica had promised. He traded his off-brand coffee for $10 artisanal lattes, wore custom-tailored Tom Ford suits, and spent his weekends sipping champagne on rented yachts on Lake Washington. He felt invincible. He had shed his dead weight. Chloe was entirely in the rear-view mirror. She hadn't contested a single thing in the divorce, vanishing into the ether of the city like a ghost. But as the winter rains set in, the gold plating on Arthur's new life began to chip. It started with small things. Jessica's credit cards began declining at dinners. At first, she laughed it off as a bank error, but when Arthur ended up footing a $1,200 dinner bill at Cannes 3 weeks in a row, he started paying closer attention. Then came the fights. Jessica was volatile. If Arthur worked past 7 p.m., she accused him of infidelity. If he didn't buy her a sufficiently expensive gift for a 1-month anniversary, she threw screaming tantrums that lasted until dawn. She wasn't a partner. She was a demanding, bottomless pit of validation. One evening in late November, Arthur stayed late at the office, going over the quarterly financials for the firm. As the new VP, he had access to the broader corporate ledgers. He was pulling up the accounts for Harrison Brentwood, his father-in-law-to-be, looking for a file, when he stumbled across something that made his blood run cold. Personal loans. Massive, company-backed personal loans. Harrison Brentwood had borrowed over $4 million against his own shares in Ovation Financial, and the loans were dangerously close to defaulting. Arthur dug deeper, his hands sweating on the keyboard. He looked at Jessica's supposedly limitless trust fund accounts. They were empty, drained. The Brentwood family wasn't wealthy. They were drowning in a sea of high-interest debt, putting on a desperate facade of opulence to keep up appearances in Seattle's high society. Suddenly, Chloe's parting words echoed in his mind. Harrison Brentwood, the regional director who just took out a second mortgage on his Mercer Island estate to cover his wife's gambling debts. How had Chloe known that? She was a freelance graphic designer who clipped coupons. There was no earthly way she could have known the intimate financial secrets of his firm's regional director. Before Arthur could process the revelation, his office door flew open. It was Harrison Brentwood himself, looking pale, disheveled, and completely panicked. "Arthur," Harrison gasped, loosening his tie. "Drop whatever you're doing. Call the board. Call everyone." "Harrison, what's wrong?" "I was just looking at—" "We're being bought out," Harrison interrupted, pacing frantically across the carpet. "A hostile takeover. They bought up 60% of our outstanding shares through shell companies over the last 3 months, and they just dropped the hammer an hour ago." Arthur stood up, his heart hammering. "Bought out? By who? Who has that kind of liquid capital to swallow Ovation in 3 months?" Harrison stopped pacing and looked at Arthur with hollow, terrified eyes. "Sterling Holdings, Richard Sterling's empire. They are gutting the executive board. The new CEO of the acquisition team is flying in next week to restructure the firm. If they look at the books— Arthur, if they look at my books, I'm going to federal prison." Arthur felt the floor drop out from beneath him. Sterling Holdings was a titan. They were a multi-billion-dollar global logistics and private equity monster. But more terrifying than the buyout was the sudden, crushing realization that he had tied his boat to an anchor. He had left a quiet, stable life for a woman whose family was about to be investigated for massive corporate fraud. He grabbed his phone to call Jessica, desperate for answers, but his screen lit up with a breaking news alert from the Seattle Business Journal. Sterling Holdings announces Ovation Financial buyout. Harris to step in as interim CEO. Arthur clicked the article. There was a photo from a recent press conference. Standing next to the legendary, ruthless billionaire Richard Sterling was a woman in a sharp, immaculate charcoal power suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture commanding, and her hazel eyes looked directly into the camera lens with absolute authority. The caption read, "Chloe Sterling, daughter of Richard Sterling, assumes leadership of the newly acquired Ovation Financial." Arthur dropped his phone. It shattered against the hardwood floor. The woman in the photo wasn't just a billionaire's daughter. It was his ex-wife. The shattered screen of Arthur's phone mirrored the sudden, violent fracturing of his reality. He stood in the center of his lavish office, the Seattle skyline looming outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling as though the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. Chloe, his Chloe, the woman who clipped 50-cent grocery coupons and wore baggy college sweatshirts, was the heir to Sterling Holdings, a $4 billion empire. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him as the memories of their divorce flooded his mind. "I need a partner who brings something to the table," he had told her. He had practically sneered at her lack of ambition, tossing away a woman who possessed more wealth and power in her little finger than the entire Ovation Financial Board combined. And she had let him do it. She had signed the papers without a fight, sitting quietly on her throne of billions, watching him proudly play the fool. He had to see Jessica. He needed to know just how deep the Brentwood family rot went. Arthur sprinted out of the Ovation building and hailed a cab, abandoning his usual polished composure. When he burst through the doors of Jessica's downtown penthouse, he didn't find the glamorous, confident woman he had left that morning. Jessica was pacing the living room, her mascara smeared, aggressively yelling into her cell phone. "I don't care what the routing number says, Charles. Move the funds from the Cayman account. If the new Sterling auditors see the negative balance, my father goes to jail." She slammed the phone down, knocking a crystal vase off an end table. It shattered, sending water and white roses sprawling across the Persian rug. She spun around, startled by Arthur's entrance. "Arthur," she snapped, her voice shrill and trembling. "Where have you been? Did my father tell you? We are under a hostile takeover. You need to get into the acquisition server and wipe the last 3/4 of executive loan data." Arthur stared at her. Stripped of her arrogant veneer, the desperation radiating from her was ugly. "I saw the ledgers, Jessica," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I saw the $4 million your father borrowed. I saw your trust fund accounts. They're completely empty. You've been living on corporate credit for a year." Jessica's face paled, then flushed with defensive rage. "So what? It was a bridge loan. We were going to pay it back after the third-quarter dividends, but this Sterling monster swept in out of nowhere and bought up the controlling shares. You have to help us cover this up, Arthur. You're the VP of Acquisitions." "Help you?" Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh. He walked toward her, shaking his head. "You lured me away from my marriage with the promise of high society. You made me think I was climbing the ladder. But there is no ladder, Jessica. You're broke. Your father is a fraud. You're a sinking ship, and you tied me to the mast." "Oh, don't play the victim," Jessica screamed, stepping into his space, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "You didn't leave your mousy little housewife because I tricked you. You left her because you're a greedy, status-obsessed social climber. You wanted the Brentwood name. Well, congratulations, Arthur. You have it. Now do your job and fix this, or you go down for corporate complicity right alongside my father." The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. She was right. As the newly appointed VP, his digital fingerprints were already all over the compromised ledgers. Ignorance would not save him from a federal audit. He was trapped. The weekend passed in a blur of panic, shredded documents, and sleepless nights. By Monday morning, the atmosphere at Ovation Financial was funeral. The lobby was swarming with private security. No one was allowed to use the elevators without temporary access badges issued by the Sterling transition team. Arthur stood in the executive boardroom on the 50th floor, alongside Harrison Brentwood and 5 other senior partners. Harrison looked like a man walking to the gallows. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. Arthur adjusted his tie, trying to project an air of calm authority. In his mind, he was clinging to a desperate, delusional hope. Chloe loved me, Arthur reasoned with himself. We were together for 8 years. She was docile. She was sweet. Underneath that new title, she's still my Chloe. If I can just get her alone, I can explain. I can apologize. She won't let her own ex-husband go to prison. I can charm her into protecting me. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. A team of 4 sharply dressed corporate lawyers entered first, carrying briefcases and iPads. Among them was a tall, athletic man with piercing blue eyes and a razor-sharp jawline, David Kensington, Sterling Holdings' ruthless chief legal counsel. Then the room went dead silent as she walked in. Chloe. But it wasn't the Chloe that Arthur knew. Gone were the messy buns, the faded sweatshirts, and the soft, apologetic smiles. She wore an immaculate, tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that screamed power. Her hair was blown out in sleek, dark waves. Her posture was perfectly straight, her chin held high, radiating a terrifying, icy dominance. She moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator stepping into a cage of wounded prey. She walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table. She didn't sit down. She placed her hands flat on the polished wood and let her gaze slowly sweep the room. When her hazel eyes finally landed on Arthur, there was no flicker of recognition, no lingering affection. There was only a cold, clinical calculation. She looked at him the way one looks at a smudge on a windowpane. "Good morning, gentlemen," Chloe said. Her voice was steady, resonant, and commanded absolute obedience. "My name is Chloe Sterling. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Sterling Holdings has officially acquired 68% of Ovation Financial. We are no longer partners. I am your owner. And as of this exact moment, your firm is undergoing a forensic financial audit." Harrison Brentwood made a strangled noise in the back of his throat. He clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Miss Sterling, please, this is highly unorthodox. A standard transition period." "Mr. Brentwood," Chloe interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You do not dictate the terms of a transition to the woman who holds the deed to your drowning company. David, the folders." David Kensington stepped forward, dropping a thick, red-tabbed file directly in front of Harrison and another identical file in front of Arthur. "Those files," Chloe continued, her voice echoing in the silent room, "contain a complete record of the $4.2 million in unauthorized personal loans funneled from client escrow accounts into the Brentwood Family Trust. It also contains the digital signature of the Vice President of Acquisitions, who attempted to delete these ledgers at 3 a.m. on Saturday morning." Arthur's heart stopped. She knew. She had been tracking his computer. "Chloe, please," Arthur blurted out, stepping forward, dropping the formalities in a moment of sheer panic. "Well, you have to listen to me. We need to talk. Alone. You know me." "I know the Vice President of Acquisitions," Chloe cut him off, her voice dropping an octave, radiating absolute authority. She didn't even blink, and right now, that vice president is a liability to my shareholders. "David, call the authorities. We are pressing federal embezzlement charges." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. The glass castle he had built for himself was completely shattering, and the woman wielding the hammer was the wife he had thrown away. Panic erupted in the boardroom the moment David Kensington tapped the screen of his phone to connect with the federal authorities. Harrison Brentwood collapsed into one of the plush leather chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands. The other senior partners scrambled toward the door, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius of Harrison's fraud. Arthur stood frozen, his mind spinning furiously. The polished, arrogant facade he had worn so proudly for the past 3 months was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, animal terror of a man cornered. He looked at Chloe. She was calmly reviewing a digital tablet, completely unbothered by the destruction she was unleashing. "Chloe, stop!" Arthur hissed, stepping closer to the head of the table. He kept his voice low, a desperate, raspy whisper. "Give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes alone. Please, for the sake of the 8 years we spent together." Chloe didn't immediately look up. She gracefully swiped to the next page on her tablet. Then she handed the device to David, who had just finished his call. "David, give us the room," Chloe commanded quietly. David nodded, shooting Arthur a look of pure disdain, before gesturing for the remaining partners and the weeping Harrison Brentwood to exit. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving Arthur and Chloe utterly alone in the sprawling, glass-walled room. Arthur immediately moved to close the distance, putting on the soft, remorseful face he used to win her over in college. "Chloe, look at me. It's Arthur. I know you're angry. I know how I handled the divorce was insensitive. But this, destroying my career, sending my boss to prison, this isn't you. You're kind. You're the woman who used to leave sticky notes on my mirror. You're not this corporate executioner." Chloe leaned against the edge of the mahogany table, crossing her arms over her tailored suit. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a smile devoid of any warmth. "You're right about one thing, Arthur," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I was kind. I was perfectly content to live a quiet, simple life away from the suffocating pressure of my father's empire. I wanted to build something genuine. I wanted a partner who loved me for who I was, not for my last name or my net worth. I thought I found that in you." She took a slow step toward him, the heels of her Louboutins clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Arthur instinctively took a step back. "But you couldn't handle simple," Chloe continued, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "You wanted to play with the sharks. You came home every day reeking of cheap ambition and another woman's perfume, mocking the very life I was actively choosing to protect you with. You proudly handed me divorce papers because I didn't bring anything to the table." She let out a dry, hollow laugh. "Arthur, I own the table. I bought the building the table sits in. I bought the bank that finances the building. And now I own you." "I didn't know," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. He raised his hands in surrender. "If I had known who you really were—" "If you had known, you would have stayed," Chloe interrupted, her tone turning to ice. "You would have played the devoted, loving husband while secretly draining my family's resources to fund your pathetic ego. You didn't reject a penniless graphic designer, Arthur. You revealed exactly what kind of man you are when you think there are no consequences." Before Arthur could formulate another desperate lie, a sudden commotion erupted outside the boardroom. Muffled shouting echoed through the thick glass, followed by the sound of scuffling shoes. The oak doors burst open violently, rebounding against the wall with a loud crack. Jessica Brentwood stormed into the room, her eyes wild, her designer coat slipping off one shoulder. She had managed to bypass the lobby security, using her father's emergency access code, though two of Sterling Holdings' private guards were close on her heels. "Get your hands off me!" Jessica shrieked, shoving one of the guards away. She scanned the room, ignoring Arthur entirely, her furious gaze locking onto the impeccably dressed woman standing at the head of the table. "Are you the Sterling representative?" Jessica demanded, marching forward, her chest heaving. "Are you the one trying to gut my father's firm? Listen to me, you corporate vulture. My family built Ovation Financial. You think you can just march in here and audit us without a fight? I will tie you up in litigation for the next decade." Arthur felt the blood drain completely from his head. "Jessica, shut up," he choked out, grabbing her arm. "Don't say another word." Jessica wrenched her arm away, glaring at him. "Don't you dare tell me to shut up, Arthur. Do your job. Tell this bureaucrat who she's dealing with." Chloe watched the exchange with mild, detached amusement. She waved a hand at the security guards, silently instructing them to stand down. They stepped back, flanking the door. "Please, let her speak," Chloe said smoothly, walking over to the leather chair Harrison had just vacated and taking a seat. She crossed her legs, looking up at Jessica like a queen observing a particularly noisy peasant. "I am absolutely fascinated to hear who I am dealing with, Miss Brentwood." Jessica planted her hands on her hips, her lip curling into a sneer. "You are dealing with Seattle royalty. We have the mayor on speed dial. We host galas for the governor. My father is Harrison Brentwood, and you are making a massive mistake." Chloe picked up the red-tabbed file from the table and idly flipped it open. "Seattle royalty," she mused. "How interesting, because according to this forensic audit, Seattle royalty, is currently $4 million in debt. Your family's Mercer Island estate has 3 liens against it. And that stunning diamond tennis bracelet you're wearing? Chloe paused, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. It was purchased last month using funds funneled directly from the retirement account of a retired school teacher named Martha Higgins. Jessica's jaw dropped. The color vanished from her face. That's a lie. My trust fund does not exist, Chloe finished for her, slamming the file shut with a sharp crack that made both Arthur and Jessica jump. Your trust fund evaporated 3 years ago to pay off your mother's offshore gambling debts. You've been living a fake, plastic life financed by stolen client money. And Arthur here, Chloe gestured dismissively toward her ex-husband, was foolish enough to help your father try and cover the tracks. Jessica spun around to face Arthur, betrayal and panic warring in her eyes. Arthur? What is she talking about? You said you fixed the ledgers. I tried, Arthur yelled, his own panic finally breaking through his carefully cultivated facade. She locked me out of the system. Jessica, you don't understand who you're talking to. Jessica looked back at Chloe, her arrogance finally fracturing into genuine confusion. Who are you? Chloe stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of her jacket. She walked around the table until she was standing mere inches from Jessica. The contrast between them was staggering. Jessica looked manic, disheveled, and cheap. Chloe radiated absolute, untouchable power. My name is Chloe Sterling, she said softly, ensuring every word landed like a physical blow. I am the CEO of Sterling Holdings. I am the new owner of Ovation Financial. And as a matter of minor historical footnote, Chloe shifted her gaze to Arthur, her lips curling into a triumphant, devastating smirk. I am the boring, penniless housewife your little toy here proudly threw away. Silence descended upon the boardroom, thick and suffocating. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant wail of a siren echoing from the Seattle streets 50 floors below. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The manic, aggressive energy that had propelled her past security evaporated entirely, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell. Her eyes darted from Chloe's immaculate Tom Ford suit to Arthur's pale, sweat-slicked face, trying desperately to reconcile this terrifying titan of industry with the mousy, coupon-clipping woman she had relentlessly mocked behind closed doors. You, Jessica stammered, taking a staggering step backward. She gripped the back of a leather chair for support, her knuckles turning white. You're the ex-wife? The freelance graphic designer? I design corporate takeovers, Miss Brentwood, Chloe corrected smoothly, stepping back toward the head of the table. Though I do dabble in watercolors on the weekends, it keeps me grounded. Arthur dropped to his knees. It wasn't a calculated move. His legs simply gave out. The sheer gravity of his mistake crushed him physically. He had traded a loyal $4 billion heiress for a bankrupt, fraudulent socialite who was about to drag him into a federal indictment. Chloe, please, Arthur begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I didn't embezzle anything. I just tried to hide the logs because Jessica said her father would fix it. I was protecting the firm. I was protecting your firm. Chloe looked down at him, her expression a mask of absolute pity. You were protecting your own fragile ego, Arthur. You wanted the corner office, the Conley dinners, the illusion of being a master of the universe. You wanted to sit at the high table so badly that you didn't even bother to check if the chairs were rotting. The wail of the sirens outside grew louder, cutting through the thick glass windows. The sound wasn't passing by. It was stopping directly in front of the Ovation Financial lobby. Jessica lunged forward, her denial twisting into violent hysteria. This is a setup. You framed us because Arthur left you. I'm calling the Wall Street Journal. I'm calling my lawyers. You won't get away with this. You vindictive... Before Jessica could finish her threat, the boardroom doors swung open again. David Kensington stepped inside, looking entirely unbothered by the screaming woman. Behind him stood 3 agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI, accompanied by 2 representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commissions. "Miss Sterling," David said calmly, nodding to his boss. "Special Agent Miller and his team from the White Collar Crime Division are here. They've already secured the server rooms and detained Mr. Harrison Brentwood in the lobby." "Excellent work, David," Chloe replied. She picked up the red-tabbed folders and walked over to the lead agent, a tall, no-nonsense man with silver hair. "Agent Miller, thank you for your prompt arrival. Here are the internal audits, the escrow transfer receipts, and the digital access logs from 3 a.m. on Saturday, showing exactly who attempted to scrub the servers." Agent Miller took the folders, flipping open the top page. He let out a low whistle. $4.2 million in unauthorized transfers. That's a bold move for a regional director. And the digital scrub attempt? "Signed and authorized by the current Vice President of Acquisitions," Chloe said, gesturing toward the floor. The agents turned to look at Arthur, who was still kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, weeping silently into his hands. "Arthur Pendleton?" Agent Miller asked, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Stand up, please. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, tampering with digital evidence, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement." "No, no, no," Arthur sobbed, frantically shaking his head as 2 agents hauled him to his feet. He looked at Jessica, desperate for a lifeline. "Jessica, tell them. Tell them it was your father. I just did what I was told." Jessica didn't answer. She was backed against the glass wall, completely paralyzed by fear as Agent Miller approached her next. "Jessica Brentwood?" the agent asked. "I don't work here," Jessica shrieked, batting her hands wildly at the agent. "I'm just a civilian. You can't arrest me. I didn't sign anything. We aren't arresting you for corporate fraud, Miss Brentwood," Agent Miller said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "However, the SEC has frozen all assets connected to the Brentwood Family Trust. This includes the Mercer Island estate, your downtown penthouse, the vehicles, and all bank accounts, as they were maintained using stolen client funds." Jessica froze, her eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. "Frozen? What do you mean, frozen? Where am I supposed to go?" "I suggest calling a friend," Agent Miller replied dryly. As the agents cuffed Arthur and began reading him his Miranda rights, Chloe walked over to her ex-husband one last time. Arthur looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his expensive silk tie askew. He looked utterly broken. "You planned this," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "The day I handed you the divorce papers. You knew." "I knew the Brentwood accounts were bleeding dry," Chloe said softly, so only he could hear. "I knew Harrison was desperate. I just didn't know how far you would go to impress people who fundamentally despise you." She reached out and gently straightened his ruined silk tie, just as she used to do in their cramped Capitol Hill apartment. But there was no love in the gesture, only a devastating finality. "You wanted to fly with the eagles, Arthur," Chloe whispered. "But you forgot that eagles are predators, and you were just the bait." She turned her back on him and walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, leaving Arthur to be dragged away into the flashing red and blue lights of his own ruin. 6 agonizing months had slowly dissolved into the bleak, grey ether since the spectacular, painfully public collapse of the Brentwood family legacy. The relentless, biting Seattle rain drummed a familiar, steady, and utterly depressing rhythm against the reinforced frosted glass of the King County Correctional Facility. It was a sound that offered no comfort, only a constant, chilling reminder of the world continuing to turn outside these impenetrable walls. Arthur Pendleton sat heavily on the painfully thin, rigid mattress of his steel-framed cot. The man who had once obsessed over the thread count of his custom-tailored Italian wool suits, who had scoffed at off-brand coffee and demanded nothing less than $10 artisanal lattes, was now drowning in a faded, standard-issue orange jumpsuit that smelled perpetually of industrial bleach and stale sweat. His cell was exactly 8 feet wide by 10 feet long. It was considerably smaller, colder, and infinitely more suffocating than the cramped Capitol Hill apartment he had once so arrogantly despised and proudly abandoned. Every single day, at precisely noon, the prison guards allowed the inmates in his maximum security block to shuffle into the concrete-walled common room for exactly 1 hour. Arthur usually kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed linoleum floor, terrified of making accidental eye contact with the hardened, desperate men who surrounded him. He had learned very quickly that an arrogant smirk in this place did not earn a promotion. It earned a broken jaw. But today, Arthur could not look away. His hollow, dark-circled eyes were glued to the small, metal-caged television mounted high in the corner of the echoing room. The local news channel was broadcasting a live, high-definition feed from the glittering, opulent ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle. The banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen was rendered in crisp, bold letters. Sterling Holdings announces historic philanthropic fund. On the screen stood Chloe. She was, in a word, breathtaking. She wore an elegant, understated navy blue gown crafted from heavy silk that draped perfectly across her frame, her hair falling in soft, immaculate waves over her shoulders. She looked entirely at peace, lacking the icy, terrifying, predatory armor she had worn during the boardroom massacre that had ended Arthur's life. Standing beside her was David Kensington, looking sharp and protective, along with Seattle's groveling mayor, 2 state senators, and a veritable army of the city's elite. Today, we are officially launching the Martha Higgins Restitution Foundation, Chloe announced to a sea of flashing camera bulbs and prominent financial journalists. Her voice, clear, compassionate, and ringing with undeniable authority, echoed out of the prison television's tinny, static-laced speakers. Ovation Financial's previous executive management devastated the lives of dozens of hard-working, innocent individuals. They systematically stripped these people of their life savings, their pensions, and their security, all to quietly fund a pathetic, hollow illusion of wealth. I am here today to assure the public that every single victim will be repaid in full, with substantial interest, directly out of my personal equity. The crowded ballroom on the television erupted into thunderous, standing applause. In the sterile prison common room, Arthur felt a physical ache tear through his chest, a crushing, suffocating weight that made it completely impossible to breathe. That radiant, powerful woman was his wife. That brilliant, compassionate, limitlessly powerful billionaire had loved him with every fiber of her being. She had quietly packed his lunches in cheap, reusable containers to ensure he had a warm meal. She had hummed softly while washing their dishes in a tiny sink. She had offered him a life of absolute security, genuine devotion, and unshakable loyalty, and he had thrown it directly into an incinerator for a handful of toxic fool's gold. Arthur's criminal trial had been swift, merciless, and completely humiliating. Harrison Brentwood, desperate, terrified, and eager to save his own skin, had immediately turned state's evidence against everyone in his orbit. But the digital paper trail Arthur had left behind was far too damning to escape. Harrison received a crushing 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Arthur, solely due to his cowardly cooperation and his lack of a prior criminal record, was sentenced to 5 hard years for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud and felony evidence tampering. 5 years locked inside a concrete cage, followed by a permanent, lifetime ban from ever holding any licenses or positions in the financial sector. His prestigious career, his carefully curated reputation, and his entire future were permanently, irreversibly dead. Meanwhile, 40 miles south in the dreary, decaying industrial outskirts of Tukwila, Jessica Brentwood was experiencing her own unique brand of agonizing, inescapable reality. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been absolutely merciless in their asset retrieval. The sprawling Mercer Island estate was swiftly foreclosed upon, seized, and auctioned off to the highest bidder. The hidden offshore accounts in the Caymans were frozen and drained. Jessica's entire designer wardrobe, her sparkling diamond tennis bracelets, the luxury imported cars, the vintage handbags, absolutely all of it was aggressively repossessed by federal agents to pay back the millions of dollars her father had stolen from the elderly and the vulnerable. Left with absolutely nothing to her name, and with her wealthy socialite friends instantly treating her like a highly infectious disease, Jessica had been violently forced into the one terrifying thing she had spent her entire pampered life avoiding: actual, grueling, minimum-wage labor. She stood behind the smudged glass counter of a discount, deeply depressing cosmetics store inside a fading, rain-soaked strip mall. She was wearing a stiff, horribly itchy polyester uniform that constantly scratched at her skin and trapped the heat. Her blonde hair, which was once styled weekly at high-end downtown salons, was pulled back in a fraying, messy ponytail, secured by a cheap elastic band. The fluorescent tubes buzzing aggressively overhead highlighted the deep, dark bags forming under her bloodshot eyes. "Excuse me," a sharp, abrasive voice snapped, yanking Jessica out of her miserable daydream. A middle-aged woman with towering hair was tapping her thick acrylic nails aggressively against the glass display counter. "I clearly asked you for the matte shade in desert rose, not this shiny garbage in dusty pink. Are you completely deaf, or just totally incompetent at your incredibly simple job?" Jessica's jaw tightened so hard her teeth ground together. A year ago, she would have destroyed this miserable woman with a single, cutting, perfectly articulated remark. She would have snapped her fingers and had security physically remove the peasant from her presence. But now, she looked down at the cheap plastic barcode scanner shaking in her trembling hand. She swallowed the bitter, burning, acidic bile of her completely shattered pride, forced her facial muscles to comply, and plastered on a stiff, thoroughly humiliating smile. "I sincerely apologize, ma'am," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the store's crackling, grating pop music playing from a blown-out ceiling speaker. "Let me go check the back stockroom for that exact shade right now." She turned quickly and practically fled into the dingy, windowless back room, collapsing against a towering stack of dusty cardboard boxes. She squeezed her eyes shut as hot, pathetic, heavy tears finally spilled over her cheeks, ruining her cheap drugstore mascara. She had absolutely nothing. She was a ghost. The proud Brentwood name, once her ultimate, glittering weapon to terrorize the social ladder, was now nothing more than a toxic, embarrassing punchline on the local evening news. Back in the suffocating prison common room, the news broadcast shifted from the bustling press conference to an exclusive, quiet, one-on-one interview with Chloe in a private suite. "Miss Sterling," Thomas Reynolds asked, leaning forward in his plush armchair, his expression incredibly serious, "you have completely revolutionized the corporate culture of the Pacific Northwest in just a matter of 6 short months. But many of our viewers are intensely curious. You lived completely undercover, so to speak, for nearly 8 years of your adult life. What is the single greatest lesson you learned during your time living a perfectly ordinary, working-class life?" Chloe smiled. It was a beautiful, genuine, profoundly warm smile, but her captivating hazel eyes held a deep, hard-earned wisdom that spoke volumes of her unseen suffering. "I learned that true, lasting wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the fluctuating balance in your investment portfolio or the brand of the suit on your back," Chloe said softly, looking directly, unflinchingly into the camera lens. "True wealth is your character. It is your unwavering loyalty. It is the precious ability to appreciate the quiet, simple, ordinary moments with the people who actually love you when you have nothing to offer them. There are millions of hard-working people in this city who have very little in their bank accounts, yet they possess a staggering richness of spirit and integrity that billions of dollars could never, ever buy." She paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. For a fleeting, terrifying second, Arthur felt as though her gaze had pierced straight through the television screen, cutting across the miles, directly into his shivering, rotting soul. And then, Chloe concluded, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a gunshot, there are people who will chase the hollow illusion of status so blindly, so desperately, that they willingly bankrupt their own souls to get it. They proudly, arrogantly, sign away their most valuable, irreplaceable assets, completely unaware that the only thing they are actually acquiring is the architecture of their own permanent destruction. Arthur couldn't bear to watch another second. His stomach violently churned. He stood up on weak, violently shaking legs and slowly walked away from the television, navigating the sea of orange jumpsuits back toward the cold isolation of his 8x10 cell. He sat back down heavily on his rigid cot, wrapping his arms around his knees, staring blankly at the unforgiving, cold cinder block wall in front of him. He closed his eyes, desperately trying to block out the reality of his existence. But in the deafening, oppressive silence of his concrete confinement, the only thing he could hear was the crisp, agonizing, incredibly final sound of a cheap ballpoint pen scratching his life away across a divorce decree. And that brings us to the absolutely epic conclusion of this incredible true-to-life saga of betrayal, blinding pride, and the ultimate, devastating hard karma. Arthur truly thought he was upgrading his life, completely unaware that he was stepping right into an inescapable trap built entirely by his own greed, leaving a $4 billion empire behind. It just goes to show that chasing superficial status and tearing down the loyal people who truly support you will always come back to haunt you in the most spectacular, devastating ways possible. What did you think of Chloe's brilliant, calculated revenge and the final, miserable fates of Arthur and Jessica? Did they get exactly what they deserved, or was the federal punishment too harsh? Let me know your unfiltered thoughts down in the comments below. If you were absolutely hooked on this dramatic story, please hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves satisfying karma stories, and subscribe to the channel for more epic storytelling. See you in the next video.